You know, usually when we dig into these deep dives, we're looking at something loud. A war, a market crash, something that just changes everything overnight. But the documents you sent over for today, they describe something, I mean, arguably more terrifying because of how quiet it was.
It's the silence that gets you, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
We're looking at a story from the mid-60s where an entire population was just erased. And I don't mean erased in the violent, Hollywood sense, though we will get to some pretty harrowing physical details, but erased legally.
Administratively.
Exactly. We are looking at the Chagos Archipelago.
And the mission today isn't just to recount the history of these islands, it's to understand the mechanism the British and U.S. governments used. I mean, we need to parse how they used bureaucracy to turn a living, breathing population into a strategic abstraction.
That phrase from the files is so key,
Right.
strategic abstraction. It really defines the whole thing. We're looking at the Chagos Archipelago between, 1965 and 1973.
And for you listening, if you think this is just some dusty colonial footnote, well, think again. This is a masterclass in how governments can use paper realities to override human realities.
Yeah.
It's about the gap between what's written on a memo in London and what is actually happening on a beach in the Indian Ocean.
So let's orient ourselves first. I pulled up a map because, honestly, before reading this, I couldn't really place it. We are deep in the Indian Ocean.
Very deep. It's about as isolated as you can get, roughly halfway between Tanzania and Indonesia.
And that isolation is really the first character in our story, isn't it? Because if this had happened somewhere like the Mediterranean or the Caribbean...
Oh, it never would have happened. Never. The isolation was the enabling factor. It allowed the British Colonial Office to treat the islands as, well, a blank canvas. Terra nullius, nobody's land.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 1965. The UK creates the British Indian Ocean Territory, or BIOT. On paper, it looks like just another acronym in the twilight of the British Empire. Standard decolonization shuffling.
Right, looks pretty routine.
But you've highlighted some correspondence here that suggests this was actually a very modern, very calculated move.
It was. You have to remember the context. The Cold War is at its absolute peak. The Soviet Union is expanding its influence. The United States is looking at the map and seeing a huge gap in their surveillance capabilities.
They need a foothold in the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. But they have a very specific requirement. They want a sanitized base.
Sanitized? Is that the actual word used in the document?
That's the word found in the historical analysis. They didn't want the complication of a local population. They wanted the land, not the people. The request was for the islands to be swept and sanitized.
And this is where the gaslighting starts.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking at the census data and the source material we have. These islands weren't empty, not by a long shot. There were schools, there were churches, coconut plantations.
And cemeteries. That's the detail that always stops me cold.
Right, the cemeteries.
You just don't build cemeteries for transient workers. You don't have 4 generations of ancestors buried in a place you're just, visiting.
No.
The Chagosians, or Iloi as they were also known, had been there since the late 18th century. They had a distinct culture, a distinct dialect of Creole. They were a settled people.
But the U.S. says, we want this empty. So how does the British government, which is technically responsible for these people, handle that? They can't just admit they're kicking out a population to build a runway.
No, of course not. That would violate the UN Charter. So they used an administrative weapon. They simply reclassified the people.
This is the big takeaway for me. If you can change the definition of a person on paper, you can strip their rights without technically breaking the law.
Precisely. They stopped calling them residents or inhabitants. In the official cables, they started referring to them exclusively as transient contract laborers.
Even the ones born there.
Even the ones whose grandparents were born there. The logic was, well, if we say there is no indigenous population, then there are no indigenous rights to violate. It was a complete legal fiction.
And they knew what they were doing.
Oh, they knew. The internal memos explicitly advise officials to be very careful about the wording. They knew they were fabricating a status to avoid legal responsibility.
It's incredible. It's a lie that became the legal reality.
Yeah.
So you have this population just living their lives, raising families, totally unaware that in an office in Whitehall, they've just been redefined as temporary workers whose contracts are up.
Exactly. And once you establish that legal fiction, well, then you can move to the physical phase.
Right. So let's move to the physical. It's 1968. The deal is signed. The U.S. gets the main island, Diego Garcia, for a military base, but there are still about 2,000 people living there. How do you get rid of them? Do they send in the Marines?
No, and that's what makes this so insidious. If they had sent in troops with guns back then, it might have made news, it might have caused a scandal. Instead, they used a squeezing tactic. It was a logistical siege.
Squeezing, it sounds so mechanical.
It was. These islands were pretty self-sufficient, fish, coconuts, but they relied on supply ships for everything else. Rice, medicine, oil, milk. The administration simply slowed the lifeline down.
So the ships just stopped coming, or
they come much less frequently. Provisions run low, life just becomes harder and harder. And then they implemented the no-return policy. This is where it gets truly cruel.
Okay.
Imagine you are a Chagosian father. You take the boat to Mauritius for some specialized medical treatment, maybe for your back, or to buy supplies for a wedding.
And when you go to the dock to buy your ticket home,
The ticket agent just looks at you and says, "Sorry, that island is closed."
with no warning, no chance to say goodbye to your kids.
Nothing. You are just stranded. And your family back on the island has no idea why you haven't come back.
Wow.
It was a way of severing the community link by link. It created panic, confusion. People started leaving just because they were terrified of being trapped.
It's a slow strangulation of a community. But then it gets violent.
We have to talk about the incident with the pets. I read this 3 times because I hoped I was misunderstanding it. It feels like something out of a movie, but it's right there in the historical record. It is the darkest part of the records. And it marks the shift from, passive squeezing to active terror.
Tell us what happened.
By 1971, the U.S. construction crews were arriving. They wanted the island cleared and faster. The British administrator, Sir Bruce Greatbatch, he decided to send a definitive message.
And he did that by...
He ordered the extermination of the islanders' dogs.
And we aren't talking about wild stray packs here. These are...
No, we are talking about family pets. The sources describe them being rounded up, hundreds of them, and gassed with exhaust fumes from military vehicles.
Oh my God.
Often while the owners, including children, were forced to watch.
It's psychological warfare.
It's a message. If we can do this to your living property, what can we do to you? It broke the spirit of the remaining population. It signaled the end of civil society. It told them the rules that protect you are gone.
And shortly after that, the final deportation happened.
Yes, the remaining population is herded onto ships, specifically one called the Nordveer.
And the conditions.
Appalling. The accounts describe people sleeping on ground-bird fertilizer in the hold. Horses were treated better.
And where are they taken? Because the narrative the government was spinning was that these people were just returning home to Mauritius or Seychelles.
That was the lie. They were taken to Mauritius and the Seychelles, yes, but it wasn't home. They were dropped on the docks.
Literally just left there.
Literally. There was no resettlement plan, no housing waiting for them, no social services, no compensation, at least not at that time.
So you have people who have lived this communal agrarian lifestyle on a, pristine archipelago, and they're suddenly thrown into the urban slums of Port Louis.
Yeah. There's a term in the reading, root shock.
Can we unpack that? Because it feels so relevant here.
It's a critical sociological concept. Root shock describes the traumatic stress reaction to the destruction of one's entire emotional ecosystem.
So it's not just losing your house.
No. You lose your identity. You lose your social safety net. You lose your purpose.
And the stats bear that out. The sources mention immediate spikes in depression, alcoholism, and debt among the Chagosian community in exile.
They were destitute. And remember, many spoke a specific dialect. They were strangers in a strange land. They went from being masters of their environment-skilled fishermen, plantation managers, to being the lowest rung of an urban society viewed as outcasts.
Meanwhile, back on Diego Garcia.
Meanwhile, the U.S. military moves in. They build a massive runway, barracks. And today, if you look at Diego Garcia, it has bowling alleys. It has bars, fast food. It is a slice of American suburbia dropped right in the tropics.
That contrast is it's nauseating. You have the original inhabitants dying of sadness in slums, literal sadness, sagrin as they call it in Creole, while military personnel are bowling on their ancestral graves.
It is a stark illustration of who matters and who doesn't in the eyes of geopolitical strategy.
But the story doesn't end in 1973. And this is where the legal battle becomes fascinating, because usually in stories like this, the government buries the files and we never hear about it again. But the Chagosans fought back.
They did. They are an incredibly resilient group. Starting in the late 90s, they started dragging the British government through the courts. And the amazing thing is, they won.
They actually won.
In 2000, the High Court in London looked at the evidence. They looked at the Magna Carta, the foundation of British law, which says no person can be exiled from their homeland. And the judge ruled that the 1971 immigration ordinance, that piece of paper that kicked them out, was unlawful.
So that should be it. Game over. Pack your bags. We're going home.
You would think so. But it brings us to the second major concept of this deep dive, the royal prerogative.
This sounds like something out of, I don't know, Game of Thrones.
It's an archaic piece of the British Constitution. Essentially, it allows the government to act on behalf of the monarch without consulting Parliament.
Okay.
After the court ruled the expulsion was legal, the government didn't appeal. They just bypassed the court entirely.
They use something called an order in council.
Exactly. In 2004, on an election day when no one was watching, they issued 2 orders in council that simply banned anyone from entering the Bayatee ever again. They effectively overruled the highest court in the land by using a loophole that dates back to the divine right of kings.
That is actually terrifying. It implies that if the strategic interest is high enough, the rule of law is just optional.
That is the chilling takeaway. The base on Diego Garcia is so valuable, it's critical for U.S. operations in the Middle East, it was used for long-range bombers, that it overrides the fundamental human rights of the Chagosian people, even when the courts say otherwise.
And there was another review in 2016, right? I remember seeing headlines about a potential resettlement.
There was a glimmer of hope. The 50-year lease with the U.S. was coming up for renewal. The UK government did a feasibility study, but they came back with the same answer, not feasible.
And the reasons they gave?
Cost and defense. They argued it would be too expensive to support a community there, and that having civilians near a bomber base was a security risk.
Security risk? I have to push back on that, just logically. There are U.S. bases in Germany, in Japan, in the UK, surrounded by civilians. Why is Diego Garcia different?
And that is the transparency paradox. We know it's not really about feasibility, it's about control. The U.S. military places a premium on total isolation. They don't want journalists, they don't want locals, they don't want prying eyes, they want a black box in the middle of the ocean.
So where does that leave us today? We have the base fully operational, we have the Chagosians still in exile, mostly in Mauritius in the UK, and we have a stack of documents that prove everything was built on a lie.
That's the current reality. The Chagos Archipelago is a strategic asset and a legal argument. It's not a home anymore.
It's so frustrating because we have the facts. The documents are unsealed. We know they lied about the population. We know the expulsion was deliberate. We know the transient laborer label was a fiction. And yet, nothing changes on the ground.
It highlights a very uncomfortable truth about international relations. Sometimes, strategic interests, hard power, simply override human rights, even when the facts are indisputable. The record has been corrected by historians and journalists, but not by the people with the power to actually open the gates.
It also speaks to why this story isn't more famous. You mentioned earlier that there was no explosion, no footage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It lacked the visual language of a scandal. There were no news crews filming the pets being killed, no cameras on the docks when the ships arrived in Mauritius. It all happened in the shadows, through paperwork. It's hard to rally public outrage around a memo, even if that memo destroys thousands of lives.
And it happened to people without political power.
That is the crucial factor. They were a small population speaking Creole, far from the centers of power. They were easily ignored. If this had happened to a population in, say, the Falkland Islands or somewhere closer to the Western sphere of influence, the reaction would have been very, very different.
But in the context of the 1960s, the Cold War, and the racial dynamics of the time,
they were deemed expendable.
Expendable? That's a heavy word.
It is. But it's the only word that fits the bureaucratic mindset we see in these files. They were viewed as an obstacle to be removed, not people to be protected.
You know, when we look at this whole deep dive, it's really a story about the power of administration. We usually fear tyrants with tanks, but this shows that a few people in suits, redefining words on a page-changing resident to laborer, can cause just as much devastation.
Absolutely. It's what happens when you strip the humanity out of decision-making. When you look at a map and you just see strategic locations instead of homes. The administrative erasure, as our outline calls it, is a very potent weapon because it leaves no fingerprints. It's all just procedure.
And it leaves us with this unresolved situation. The Chagosians are still fighting. The UK and Mauritius are actually arguing over sovereignty now, aren't they? There have been rulings of the International Court of Justice.
Yes. The ICJ has issued an advisory opinion saying the UK's administration is unlawful and the islands should be returned to Mauritius. The UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to tell Britain to leave, but again, enforcement is the issue. A court in The Hague can say one thing, but if the ships don't move and the fences don't come down, the reality on the ground doesn't change.
So it's a standoff between international law and raw geopolitical power.
That's a perfect way to put it. And so far, power is winning.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway for you? What's the thing that keeps you up at night about this story?
For me, it's the closed record. The idea that a government can just decide a chapter of history is closed, even while the people involved are still suffering. It makes you wonder what other administrative decisions are being made right now in quiet offices that we won't understand the full human cost of for another 30 or 40 years.
That's a really scary thought. It's not just history, it's a warning about how bureaucracies function.
Precisely. We have to look past the official language. When we hear terms like strategic realignment or population management, we need to ask, who are the people behind those words? What is happening to them?
And that leads us to our final thought for the listeners. We've seen how paperwork can be used as a weapon. We've seen how a legal fiction can trap a people in exile.
The question is, when a population is erased through paperwork rather than violence, at what point does responsibility expire?
And who has the authority to decide that the historical record is closed?
Because if the people are still suffering, the past isn't past, it's the present.
That's it for this deep dive into the Chagos Archipelago. It's a heavy one, but an essential case study in how the world really works. We've linked the full timeline and the source documents in the show notes. If you want to understand how bureaucracy can be weaponized, take a look. Thanks for listening.